The Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, is remembered as the greatest act of international generosity in history, America providing $13 billion, equivalent to roughly $150 billion today, in economic aid to rebuild war-devastated Europe, helping former enemies alongside allies, asking for nothing in return except that Europeans cooperate with each other and adopt sound economic policies. And this act of altruism supposedly demonstrated American moral leadership, proved that capitalism was more generous than communism, prevented European countries from falling into Soviet orbit, and created the foundations for European prosperity and Atlantic partnership that persists today. And all of this is true. The Marshall Plan did accomplish these things, did help rebuild Europe, did prevent communist expansion, did create lasting alliances. But this conventional narrative misses the strategic calculation that motivated the plan, misses that it was designed primarily to serve American interests, was arguably the most brilliant exercise in enlightened self-interest in diplomatic history, achieving American goals by making them align with European needs, creating dependencies and structures that would serve American purposes for decades, and doing all this while gaining credit for generosity rather than being seen as imposing American dominance. So the Marshall Plan worked not because Americans were uniquely altruistic, but because American strategists, particularly George Marshall and Dean Acheson and George Kennan, understood that the best way to secure American interests was to rebuild European economies, integrate them with American capitalism, bind them into American-led institutions, and create structures of dependence that would be voluntary, would be welcomed by Europeans, and would be far more effective than coercion or occupation. And understanding this strategic dimension, understanding that the Marshall Plan was fundamentally about constructing American hegemony in ways that would be stable and legitimate and self-sustaining. This reveals both the brilliance of American post-war planning and the nature of soft power, the ability to achieve dominance through attraction rather than through force, through creating systems where other countries benefit from American leadership and therefore support it, where hegemony is consensual rather than coercive, at least on the surface, and where the hegemon can claim moral authority rather than admitting power politics, making the Marshall Plan the template for how modern empires operate, not through conquest, but through institutional design, not through extraction, but through integration, not through visible domination, but through hidden dependencies that make resistance costly and coordination with the hegemon beneficial. The immediate context was Europe's economic catastrophe. By 1947, European recovery from World War II was stalling. Initial reconstruction had occurred, but economies weren't growing. Food production remained below pre-war levels. Industrial capacity was damaged. Infrastructure was destroyed. Dollar shortages prevented importing American goods. And the winter of 1946 to 47 was brutally cold, causing energy crises and food shortages, and communist parties were gaining strength, particularly in France and Italy, where they had credible chances of winning elections or taking power through general strikes. And this threatened American strategic interests multiple ways. Communist governments in Western Europe would align with Soviet Union, would reject Marshall economic integration, would provide bases for Soviet power projection, and would demonstrate that communism could succeed in developed countries, not just in agrarian Russia or China, undercutting American ideological claims that capitalism was superior. So preventing communist expansion in Europe was vital American interest. But the question was how. Military occupation was expensive and would create resentment. Direct political intervention would be seen as imperialism, and simply giving money without conditions wouldn't ensure it was used effectively. So American planners needed an approach that would rebuild European economies, prevent communist takeovers, bind Europe to America, and do all this in ways that Europeans would welcome rather than resist. And the Marshall Plan was that approach, brilliant in its design, combining economic aid with conditions that served American interests, requiring European cooperation and integration that would create structures favoring American influence, and framing everything as generous assistance rather than as strategic manipulation. The economic logic was that European recovery would benefit America directly. Europe before the war had been America's largest export market. But post-war Europe couldn't afford to buy American goods, lacked dollars, so American exports were constrained and American factories were underproducing. risking unemployment and recession at home, and business interests feared that without export markets, the American economy would slump into depression as it had after World War I. So providing Europe with dollars to buy American goods would sustain American production, maintain employment, prevent recession, and the Marshall Plan dollars were largely tied aid, had to be spent on American products, so the aid directly subsidized American producers and farmers. Wheat and machinery and coal exported to Europe were paid for by American taxpayers, creating market for American goods that European poverty made impossible. And this was economically brilliant, turned European poverty from problem into opportunity, used aid dollars to create demand for American exports, and the Europeans benefited because they needed the goods, but Americans benefited more because the aid was less than the value of exports. The net effect was subsidizing American production while rebuilding European economies. A win-win that primarily benefited America, but that gave Europe enough benefit to make participation attractive. The political conditions were more important than the economic aid. Marshall Plan wasn't just money. It required Europeans to cooperate with each other, to reduce trade barriers, to coordinate economic policies, to create institutions for managing the aid collectively. And these requirements served American strategic interests. European cooperation reduced nationalism and conflict, made another European war less likely, which served American interest in European stability. European economic integration created larger markets that American companies could access, reduced barriers to American trade and investment, made Europe more economically dependent on Atlantic trade rather than on regional autarky, and the institutions created to manage Marshall Aid. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation became permanent, evolved into institutions that coordinated European and American economic policies, created forums where American influence could be exercised, where European policies could be aligned with American preferences. So the Marshall Plan wasn't just temporary aid. It created permanent institutional architecture that embedded American influence in European governance, made European economies structurally dependent on Atlantic integration, and created mechanisms through which American power could be exercised continuously without appearing coercive. Because the institutions were technically European, were governed by Europeans, but were designed to coordinate with American interests, to maintain the Atlantic partnership that the Marshall Plan established. The anti-communist dimension was explicit. The Marshall Plan was offered to all European countries, including the Soviet Union and its satellites, but with conditions that made Soviet participation impossible. The conditions required opening economies to American observation, coordinating with Western institutions, accepting market-oriented reforms. And Stalin understood that accepting these conditions would mean opening Soviet bloc to American influence, would undermine Soviet control over Eastern Europe. So he rejected the plan and forced Eastern European countries to reject it as well. And this was exactly what American planners wanted. They designed conditions that would appeal to Western Europeans but repel Soviets, creating a bright line between the Western aid recipients and the Soviet bloc refusers, demonstrating that America offered prosperity while Soviet Union offered continued poverty. And this demonstration effect was powerful. Eastern Europeans could see their Western neighbors receiving aid and recovering while they remained poor under Soviet control, and this created resentment against Soviet domination, contributed to the tensions that would eventually lead to 1989's revolutions. So the Marshall Plan was anti-communist not just by preventing communist takeovers in the West, but by creating contrasts that undermined Soviet legitimacy in the East, showing that alignment with America brought prosperity while alignment with Soviet Union brought stagnation. And this ideological victory was as important as the economic aid, proved that capitalism delivered and communism didn't, established narrative that would dominate Cold War and that would ultimately contribute to Soviet collapse. The creation of dependencies was subtle but profound. European countries that accepted Marshall Aid became dependent on continued access to American markets, on American investment, on American technology, and on the institutional frameworks that the Marshall Plan created. This wasn't coercive dependency, wasn't imposed through force, but it was real. European prosperity became tied to Atlantic integration, to maintaining good relations with America, to participating in American-led institutions, and this gave America influence over European policies. America could threaten to withdraw access or support if European governments pursued policies America opposed, and this threat was rarely explicit, but was always present. European leaders understood that antagonizing America would be costly, would risk their access to markets and institutions and support that their prosperity depended on. So they generally aligned their policies with American preferences, not always, not completely, but enough to make the Atlantic Alliance function on terms that served American interests, and this was far more effective than the colonial control that European powers had exercised over their empires, because it was voluntary, was chosen by European leaders who saw the benefits exceeding the costs, and because it was legitimate, was seen as partnership rather than domination. Even though the power asymmetry was substantial, even though America was clearly the senior partner, making most of the decisions, the dollar's entrenchment as reserve currency was accelerated by the Marshall Plan. The aid was provided in dollars, required Europeans to hold and use dollars, expanded the role of the dollar in international trade, and reinforced the Bretton Woods system where the dollar was central, and this benefited America enormously. As we discussed earlier, being the reserve currency provides seigniorage, allows running deficits that other countries must finance, and the Marshall Plan ensured that the dollar would remain dominant even as American relative economic power declined. Because European economies were integrated into dollar-based systems, conducted trade in dollars, held reserves in dollars, and the alternatives, returning to national currencies or creating new international currencies, would require unwinding the structures that Marshall Plan created, would be costly and disruptive. So even when European economies recovered and potentially could have challenged dollar dominance, they didn't. They remained within dollar-based systems because the transition costs would have been prohibitive, and this locked-in dollar dominance was one of Marshall Plan's most valuable strategic achievements, created monetary hegemony that would persist for generations, far beyond the 4 years that Marshall aid was actually dispersed. The corporate dimension is often overlooked. American corporations were major beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan. They received contracts to provide goods and services, established operations in Europe, gained access to European markets, and the plan's requirements for European economic integration created larger markets that American multinationals could exploit. Before the Marshall Plan, Europe was fragmented. Each country had its own regulations and tariffs and currencies, making continental scale operations difficult. But the integration that the plan required began reducing these barriers, started the process that would eventually create the European Union, and American corporations benefited from this integration even more than European ones. Because American firms were larger and had experience operating across large markets and had capital and technology advantages. So European integration created by the Marshall Plan made Europe accessible to American corporate expansion, and the corporate interests that benefited lobbied to continue policies that sustained this access, created business constituencies for Atlantic integration, and these constituencies influenced both American and European policies, pushed for further integration, for NATO expansion, for trade liberalization, all serving both corporate profits and broader American strategic interests, demonstrating that strategic brilliance often lies in creating constituencies that support your goals and making private interests align with public policy, so that achieving state objectives becomes profitable for influential actors who then lobby to continue those objectives. The military integration followed from economic integration. The Marshall Plan was civilian aid, but it created conditions for NATO. Countries that were economically integrated with America and dependent on American markets were natural candidates for military alliance, and NATO, established in 1949 as Marshall aid was being distributed, created military dependencies that paralleled economic ones. European countries depended on American security guarantees, on American nuclear umbrella, on American military technology and logistics. And this military dependence, like economic dependence, gave America influence. European countries had to align their security policies with American preferences, had to support American global strategy, had to provide bases and overflight rights and political support for American military operations. And this was far more efficient than maintaining large American occupation forces. Instead of directly controlling Europe militarily, America controlled through alliance structures where Europeans paid for their own defense under American leadership, provided their own forces that were integrated into American command structures, and supported American global strategy because their security depended on American commitment. So the Marshall Plan's economic integration created preconditions for military integration that would serve American strategic interests throughout the Cold War and beyond. The propaganda value was enormous. The Marshall Plan became symbol of American generosity and moral leadership, was contrasted with Soviet exploitation of Eastern Europe, demonstrated that America was different from previous imperial powers, was helping rather than extracting, and this propaganda was valuable in winning hearts and minds globally, particularly in the developing world where decolonization was occurring and where countries were choosing between American and Soviet models. The Marshall Plan suggested that aligning with America meant prosperity and aid, while aligning with Soviet Union meant poverty and domination, and this influenced choices in Latin America, Asia, Africa. Countries that saw Marshall Plan success wanted similar aid, wanted to be part of American-led system, and while most didn't receive anything like Marshall Plan levels of aid, the example was powerful, created expectations and desires that pulled countries toward American orbit, and even when American behavior elsewhere contradicted the generous Marshall Plan image, the image persisted. The plan created goodwill that America could draw on for decades, created brand equity that served American interests in countless subtle ways, making the plan's propaganda value perhaps as important as its economic or strategic value, certainly worth far more than the $13 billion nominal cost. The counterfactual where Marshall Plan didn't occur is instructive. Without it, European recovery would have been slower. Communist parties might have gained power in France and Italy. European economies might have remained fragmented and nationalistic. Dollar might have lost its reserve status. And most importantly, the institutional architecture of American hegemony might not have been established. The Atlantic Alliance might not have formed, or might have formed later and more weakly. And American global leadership in the second half of the 20th century might not have been possible, or might have been far more costly, requiring military coercion rather than willing cooperation. So the Marshall Plan's return on investment was extraordinary. $13 billion bought decades of European alignment with American interests, established monetary and institutional hegemony that persists today, prevented communist expansion, created markets for American exports, and did all this while earning America a reputation for generosity and moral leadership. It's hard to imagine a more cost-effective strategic initiative, which is why it's studied by strategists globally, why China's Belt and Road Initiative is often compared to it, why soft power is now understood to be potentially more effective than hard power. All because the Marshall Plan demonstrated that you could achieve hegemony through aid and institution building rather than through conquest and coercion. The limitations were that the plan worked only because conditions were favorable. Europe already had industrial capacity and educated populations and institutional memories of prosperity. The aid was rebuilding rather than building from scratch, and Europeans wanted to align with America, saw it as preferable to Soviet domination. So the plan succeeded partly because European and American interests aligned, and attempts to replicate the Marshall Plan elsewhere largely failed. Development aid to Africa and Asia didn't produce Marshall Plan results because conditions were different, because institutions and capacity were lacking, because alignment of interest wasn't present, because aid was often diverted through corruption or misused. So the Marshall Plan's success wasn't purely about aid generosity or institutional design. It depended on recipient characteristics and contextual factors that can't be replicated everywhere, making the plan's lessons limited, not a template that works universally, but a model that works under specific conditions. And recognizing this is important for understanding both why the plan succeeded and why similar initiatives often fail. The modern relevance is that the Marshall Plan model of using economic integration to achieve strategic goals remains the foundation of American foreign policy. Trade agreements, alliance structures, institutional leadership, all of these follow Marshall Plan logic, using economic benefits to create dependencies and alignments that serve American interests while appearing to benefit all participants. And challenges to this model, from Brexit to Trump's transactionalism to China's Belt and Road. These represent attempts either to break from American-led integration or to create alternative models, And whether these challenges succeed will determine whether the post-World War II order that the Marshall Plan helped establish persists, or whether we're transitioning to something different, to a multipolar world where American institutional hegemony declines, where economic integration occurs on terms not set by America, where soft power becomes less effective as recipients understand the dependencies it creates and resist them. So the Marshall Plan's legacy is still being contested, the system it created is still operative but is under pressure, and understanding the plan's strategic logic, understanding that it was about constructing hegemony through attraction rather than about pure generosity. This helps understand current conflicts, helps see that challenges to American leadership are challenges to the institutional architecture that the Marshall Plan began building, and that defending American interests requires not just military power, but maintaining the economic and institutional structures that make American leadership attractive, that create benefits for participants sufficient to maintain their cooperation, and that this has become harder as American relative power declines, as alternatives emerge, as the propaganda value of Marshall Plan generosity fades into historical memory, leaving just the structural realities of dependence and hierarchy that some countries increasingly resent and resist, making the Marshall Plan's true achievement not the aid it provided, but the hegemonic system it established, a system that served American interests brilliantly for 70 years, that may now be reaching its limits. And that reveals through its success and its current challenges that the most effective power is power that doesn't appear to be power, that presents itself as partnership and generosity while actually being strategic domination, that achieves compliance through creating dependencies rather than through threatening force. And that can be extraordinarily effective when conditions are right, but that can also unravel when conditions change, when recipients become strong enough to resist, when alternatives emerge, when the benefits of cooperation no longer outweigh the costs of subordination, which may be where we are now, making the Marshall Plan story not just history, but prologue to current struggles over global economic order, over who will lead and who will follow, and on what terms, struggles that will determine whether American hegemony persists or whether the system that the Marshall Plan built will be replaced by something different, by multipolar governance, or by Chinese hegemony, or by fragmentation. Outcomes that will depend partly on whether America can renew the strategies that made the Marshall Plan successful, can offer sufficient benefits to maintain cooperation, can adapt institutions to changing power realities, or whether, like all hegemons eventually, American power will decline and the order it created will be replaced by something new, making the Marshall Plan's ultimate lesson not that generosity works, but that strategic brilliance combined with favorable conditions can create systems that last for generations, but that eventually, inevitably, must either adapt or collapse as conditions change and power balances shift. The fate of all empires, even those that rule through institutions rather than through conquest, through dollars rather than through guns, through Marshall Plans rather than through martial law.